All right. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the D.Y. Patil Postgraduate Lecture Series. We have our young colleagues with us today to share their perspective of psychiatry as well as what postgraduate training should be. Dr. Swaroop Bhatankar has very kindly agreed to chair today's session. She is a postgraduate student from KM Hospital. She is an associate fellow in REBT from the Albert Ellis Institute, New York. She's been working at the IPH since 2019 as a consultant psychiatrist. She was earlier with BJ Medical as well as with DY Patil Hospital at Navi Mumbai as an assistant professor. She is a founder of Awakening Psychiatric Clinic and Counseling Center, and she has a special interest in child and adolescent psychiatry. So thank you very much, Swaroop, for making the time and being with us today. And she will introduce Dr. Abhijna to you and take over the proceedings. I'll come back to you towards the end of the program. Over to you, Swaroop.
Thank you, sir, for giving me an opportunity to be a part of this wonderful program. I think gender and alcohol is a very, very interesting topic. And in my opinion, during our residency, we are taught, and we also see, especially in government setup, a lot of men being very predominant in alcohol consumption, and we see a lot of alcohol withdrawal, especially in the emergency services where male gender is very, very predominant. But as we move on from residency to to our own private practice, especially in the urban setup and in the metropolitan cities where there's a corporate culture, where we see that this gender gap is now reducing very, very drastically. Women are equally part of social culture where drinking is a very, very acceptable norm, and we see a lot of women as well, landing up with a lot of substance abuse, especially alcohol abuse, even showing patterns of dependency. So I think this is a very, very interesting topic, and I'm sure that Dr. Abhijna will throw a light on this wonderful topic. I have been given a slide to introduce her, but correct me if I'm wrong, Abhijna, did you get your first, I think your first, in your first round, I think you got KM, right?
In our
NEET, PG resident,
we were the first fortunate batch of NEET PG. So yeah, I did get in KEM. I worked there for a short.
Yeah, I remember because you were there. I was that time in my third year, and you were there for 15 days, and then you said, "No, I'm going to NIMHANS. I'm going to NIMHANS," and then you vanished. So that's what I just remembered. By seeing you. So, anyways, Dr. Abhijna is a consultant psychiatrist in Mumbai, working primarily with women and adolescents. Substance use and neurodivergence are her areas of interest. She is lucky enough to have worked in 3 cities, Mumbai, Kolkata, and Bangalore, and 4 kinds of setup. Sion NIMHANS for her post-graduation Institute of Neuroscience, Kolkata, which is allied with Newcastle University and has her own private practice. She says she's not an ambitious person, and I think I don't agree with that because I have seen that shade of yours that you're quite competitive and ambitious when you join for a small tenure of your 15 days in KM. She hopes to have a proper setup as soon as possible to afford a library, coffee machine, and time to chatter a lot. Please spread the word so that you can make this come true. Okay, interesting. So I hand over to you and let's roll over.
Thank you, Dr. Swaroop. I hope that you've had a good impression of me on the brief 15 days.
Sure. Definitely. That is why you are here. Definitely.
Okay. Thanks a lot. And I was considered a very outstanding student. I mean, I put that in quotes, outstanding students in NIMHANS, because I was rarely seen within the journal club attendance and the symposia, all of it. And that was a frequent grouse. And the teachers there, you should attend more of academics, and I sincerely hope that whoever has joined today will not follow my footsteps and will be within the the Zoom meeting and not leave us out in the cold. So that's my I think my primary wish for today. And I want to thank Rashmin sir, because in the past month especially, we've seen how rare good teachers can be. I mean, with all the incidents happening in the doctor community. So we are very, very happy that we've got this platform, that we have, it's a very intellectually stimulating place where there's core academics and very pure academics going on. So I thank you for that, and a happy Teachers' Day to everyone who's here. Yes. All right. So with everyone's permission, can I start the presentation? All right. Switch to-
Sure, sure. Please go ahead.
Yes, yes. Okay. So. Is this fine with everyone? Okay.
Yes, we can see it.
Just let me adjust the. Okay. All right. So for today, I thought gender and alcohol would be a very fantastic, interesting topic to start with. When we think of gender in medicine, it's usually restricted to the incidence and the prevalence differences between men and women, and how their course runs different, which is interesting by itself. But I think what I discovered during residency and later on till now is that the differences are far more intricate, extending to our preclinical studies. And I hope to kind of expand on that in today's session. Alcohol, of course, and substance use is a massively interesting subspecialty of psychiatry. It touches on a lot of other specialties as well: child and adolescent, women, medicine, neurology. So overall, the convergence of these two topics, I think, would be quite interesting. All right. So I go on to the first slide, and I'm only going to focus on gender and medicine. I'll just focus on this particular aspect. And so we hear a lot of people saying trust the science, and we hear a lot of doctors saying trust the science. And when someone says that, I get a bit taken aback, because science has always evolved. So what holds true today, we must have accept that with a pinch of salt, right? So I'm going to talk about the importance of gender in medicine, and specifically why in our clinical trials, there's a lack of reproducibility. What that means is the results that you get out of a particular trial, the next trial that you do, the results might vary a lot or not, but they're never rarely equally reproducible. And so the National Institute of Health, they pointed out that's possibly because we were not looking at sex differences as central to a reproducible scientific technique. So in 1993 and in 2015, again, the NIH, they had a mandate that stated that women were required to be included in phase 3 clinical trials. And now they expect that you will have to look at sex as a biological variable. And in very simple terms, I'm going to look at 2 real life examples and how that might inform our practice. So I think we've all heard of the adage to give low dose aspirin if someone has a cardiac illness, and prevent future heart attacks. And this was based on the reports of a committee in 1989. It was a steering committee of the physicians, and they came to the conclusion that low dose aspirin was massively helpful in preventing heart attacks. And we have applied that as well in our clinical practice. We've applied low dose aspirin, given low dose aspirin to a lot of people. What did come up in 2003 was that this advice is very specific for men, because the original trial, the participants were predominantly male. But when you look at female participants, low dose aspirin really does not help a lot. Okay, so that's a practice that needs to be overturned or looked at again carefully. Coming to substance abuse, and specifically benzodiazepine dependence, I think the FDA issued a warning somewhere, I guess in 2013, that women who were taking zolpidem were noted to be, sedated in the daytime, were getting into more accidents. And they found out that the dose that should be prescribed to them should be half of that for what we should prescribe men, and the timing and the dosing of that should be adjusted to take that into account. So a lot of our clinical practice is actually informed by differences in gender biology in real life, right? And in alcohol use especially, the number of women who were recruited in the trials have been abysmally low. Rarely 50%, or no, not 50% to my knowledge, but at least at the bare minimum, reflecting population statistics. A couple of trials were there, but none which have really looked at it very wholeheartedly. And then we go on to alcohol. I mean, it's been romanticized to such a great extent, and there are such polarizing opinions of it, right? So then, a long while back, the Greeks had a, they had a saying that water is injurious to health. And at that point in time, there was a very widely held belief that people who drank water, they emitted foul odor. So whenever someone who didn't drink alcohol, when they would come to a public bath, everyone would get up out of the bath, and they would leave the vicinity. And then Louis Pasteur said that wine is the healthiest, most hygienic beverage known to man. So that was one end of the spectrum. And then gradually it swung to extremely a condescending, prohibitive, morally reflecting stance, wherein alcohol was a poison, was extremely bad for health, and then prohibition came into effect. And then again, I think in between it came to a middle point wherein they said, well, look at the French, it's called the French paradox. Look at the French, they have alcohol, they eat carbs, and look how healthy they are. So possibly a moderate amount of alcohol within safe limits is something that would benefit us all. So with that, I think till very recently, we worked with the belief that a moderate amount of alcohol was probably beneficial for us. Now, how did we come to this particular limit, moderate drinking, and how did we set the limit? So in India right now, one standard drink is 10 grams of pure ethanol, and that roughly translates to one small glass of red wine of 100 ml, a can of beer 375, and spirits 30 ml. But that has varied historically through time. So at one point in time in Japan, it was 28 grams of pure ethanol was supposed to be a standard drink. And in Austria, 5 grams of pure ethanol was supposed to be a standard drink. Great Britain, they have this concept of units, and they said 21 units for male and 14 units for female is all good. But when you ask the working group there, on what basis did you pick up these standards? One person literally answered, we just plucked it out of the air. And then when we extend the concept of safe limits to binge drinking, it's roughly around 5 standard drinks for males and 4 standard drinks for females within a span of 2 hours. On the right, you can see the cover of a book, The Sun Also Rises. It's written by a fantastic author called Ernest Hemingway. Also has use with alcohol use disorders. And so he talks about a particular city in Spain, Pamplona, associated with the bull races over there. And he says that within a certain week in July, and this practice continues till date, everyone gets blindly drunk for that 1 week. So patterns of drinking of such sort brought binge drinking into notice. And after that, safe limits for binge drinking were also brought into formal review. Overall, before we go any further, let's get some stats very, very clear. We do know that first, compared with women, throughout the world, men are more likely to drink. They're more likely to consume more alcohol. The quantity is supposed to be more. And they're more likely to cause more problems by doing so. And this is a gender gap, which is one of the few universal gender differences in our behavior. So if you look at the WHO statistics here, the WHO has divided the world into sub-regions. And in each sub-region, you will see that the males always outnumber the females. The percentage males always outnumber the females. The gap may vary. In some, it may be more. In some, it may be less. But the gap is always there. On the right, we do see that men are disproportionately affected with respect to dailies compared to women. We do know that alcohol attributable deaths do impact men at a more higher rate compared to women, so 7.7 and 2.6. So what could be the reasons for this gender gap? One common I think the first reason that comes to mind is that men and women, our metabolisms are fairly different. So our blood, the distribution of the volume of distribution in women is fairly lesser. So our blood alcohol levels at the same level when we consume the same amount of alcohol, the blood alcohol level is around 30% more for women than men. But there was a study done in New England Journal of Medicine, I believe, I might be wrong, where they injected ethanol and they said, well, the blood alcohol levels are roughly similar. So what could it be? And then it came about that possibly women have lower rates of gastric metabolism of alcohol. And that's the reason why, for the same amount of alcohol consumed, women had a higher level. Because they had a higher level, they were more likely than men to experience some unpleasant effects. They have poorly, or they may not enjoy the risky and poorly controlled behavioral effects of alcohol as much as men. The second reason could be cultural. So alcohol consumption is a very gendered phenomena. For men, it may be a sign of masculinity, a sign of bonding. And for women taking it, it might be looked down upon. It may be a source of stigma, right? So, so this could be a way of society, could be a way by which society would differentiate between the cultural roles of men and the cultural roles of women. The third reason is slightly more sinister. It could be because the consequences for alcohol abuse and alcohol dependence are far more for women than men. And there have been documentations of custody of children being taken away and women being forced into prisons or hospitalized, separated from their children, if alcohol use was suspected. Coming to the conjunction, so women and men, alcohol consumption and the differences between them, we can look at it at several levels. At a very gross global level, there are population level differences, and we'll briefly touch on that. Neurobiology, there are selected domains that I'll be speaking about. We'll be talking of genetics and heritability, and in terms of the clinical cause, telescoping, characteristics, and risk patterns in women. The next two points I've highlighted: psychiatric, medical comorbidities, and outcome. So these deserve a complete lecture by themselves. So I've just touched upon them. And after that, I'll be touching on treatment, which means what are the kind of service components that benefit women compared to men. We'll be looking at pharmacotherapeutic differences and policy level differences. After that, we'll bid adieu and I think relax a bit. All right. So globally, we have seen that the trends in alcohol consumption worldwide is decreasing. So it was 5.7 liters in 2010. Right now it's 5.5 liters, roughly 3 standard drinks per day. The converse is happening in India. And so it has risen from 1.6 liters, then 2.2 liters to 5.5 liters. So we are at a transition zone in India right now. And then we have a tale of two Indias. So the National Family Health Survey is a massive exercise conducted by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. And what they do is they take representative household and they sample on a variety of social indicators. Alcohol use is one of them. So I've got data, we've got data from 3 of the NFHS, that is NFHS 3, NFHS 4, and NFHS 5. And here, contrary to expectations, the proportion of men who are consuming alcohol has decreased. So 32%, 29.5%, and most recently 18.7%. If you look at women, that trend is decreasing as well. So there's 2.2%, 1.2%, and 1.3%. If you compare that with the experience we have in our clinical setup, we do find that more and more women are drinking. This does not resonate so well with that. And the alcohol industry has also said that they're expecting a turnover of 25% within the next couple of years. So that does not gel well with the findings in NFHS. So when you look at surveys which solely look at substance use, NMHS, NNCD, CDMS, this particular survey by Ambekar et al., they do show fairly, higher levels of alcohol consumption. And the last survey shows that 1 in 5 males is dependent and 1 in 16 females is dependent. The problematic use that we are noting though is that younger and younger cohorts are getting introduced to alcohol at earlier ages. So previously, the average age at which a person would be introduced to alcohol would be 19 years. Currently, it's 13 years. We do see binge pattern being predominant, solitary heavy drinking being quite common. We see the alcohol industry targeting women specifically with flavors, fruity drinks. So we are at a place wherein India is at a stage where we are consuming more alcohol perhaps, or per capita alcohol perhaps, and we do not have the resources to manage the downstream effects of it, right? So that's what I said, higher per capita consumption among drinkers in India, high prevalence of heavy episodic drinking, we have a higher disease burden, and an increase in the proportion of men who reported use almost every day. Worldwide till now, the rates of AUD is 7%, in India it's 4.7%. But I think there's a lot of underreporting and a lot of unaccounted consumption of alcohol that we are not taking into account. So there's the study called Genesis, and it spanned a number of countries from low and middle income areas, and India was one of them. And a common finding was that both males and females in India consumed alcohol in rural areas more than in urban areas. And in women, they noted that there were two peaks. So one peak in women was women who were not educated to a higher level. They were earning in the lower quartile of the national income. They were drinking alone and they were drinking to get drunk. On the other hand, we have a second peak of urban sophisticated working women, and the choice of alcohol would also be different. So we have got two cohorts or two groups of women who are at particular risk. Right. And then we come to this term called gender convergence. What does it mean? There's a particular ratio of men drinking to women drinking, and that varies between regions, and that has varied across time. So right now, if we look at a sliding scale from the higher income countries to the low and middle income countries, we say men and women are equally drinking in the higher income regions versus in the lower income regions. So if the ratio is 1.2 to 1 in high income countries, it's 1.5:1 in middle income countries, and 1.8:1 in lower middle income countries. So across the globe, we do see there's the gap, but they're slowly converging as we go higher up in the socioeconomic scale. But across time also, we are seeing a trend wherein recent cohorts, the recent generation of women, are getting exposed to alcohol at an earlier age, and their drinking patterns are also resembling that of males. And at certain points in time and in certain studies, we have also noted they have overtaken alcohol consumption. And that has happened post 1966 and post 1991. So this is a very good study that if one gets the time, one can read at leisure. And it does say the very same thing, but they can't give an explanation for it. Why 1966? Why 1991? They're also not able to say, is the gap decreasing because men are drinking less, or is it because women are drinking more, right? So they do not theorize as to the reasons for the same. CDAT did a wonderful paper on the reasons why this gap is converging. They say as the gender roles are getting less and less traditional, the gap is converging. And so in countries which have higher parity between men and women and their gender roles, you'll see the gap closing down. So they say entering the labor force by age 35, having higher education levels, median age of first marriage being increased, are reasons why the gender gap is slowly converging. In this particular study, this is from Australia, they saw a generational increase in young women's drinking. So they looked at mothers who presented at a hospital in Australia, and then they followed up the kids, the daughters of those mothers, maybe 21, 30 years later, and they found that yes, women were drinking at a 5 times higher rate compared to their mothers. And what they found, though, was very striking, that having a partner or cohabitation in the daughters was associated with a significantly higher risk of drinking. This, I had forgotten to mention, was also reflected in the Genesis study, where having a partner or being married had a higher risk of alcohol consumption than being single. So that I think would give us pause, and we would need to think of how permissive is it now to drink alcohol with partners compared to before, right? Going on to sex differences in neurobiology, I think we should know the different kinds of sex differences. So we have qualitative differences, which is basically comparing apples and oranges. A woman produces an ovum once in 28 days. A man produces sperm daily. So you can't really compare these two kind of phenomena. So these are called qualitative differences. Quantitative differences, well, I'm speaking at a certain number of words per minute, maybe 100 words per minute. A man might be speaking at 20 words per minute. So our responses are the same, but the magnitude differs. That's called quantitative differences. Population differences are distribution of behaviors and how they differ within populations. So I can say that 60% of men go into science, 40% of women go into humanities, or 70% of our nurses are women, 30% are men. So those are called population differences. Very interesting, though, is the next kind of difference called mechanistic differences. It kind of tells that the end behavior might be similar for men and women, but the pathways might be completely different. For example, I might cry and a boy might cry, but the pathway by which that behavior was manifested in males and females is perhaps completely different. So these are very illuminating kind of things to ponder over. This is taken from a very good paper by Krug and Walco. And this particular group has done a lot of work in gender differences and alcohol consumption. All right. From the same paper, they say that at each stage of the addiction cycle, we are able to perceive differences, right? And they have looked at both humans, and they have looked at both humans and rodents as well. So what they do say is that in humans, the amount of intake is more in males than females, and we've seen that. The incidence is more in males than females, and we've seen that as well. They also say that the escalation of use from the time you take your first drink to development of dependence, that escalation of use is far more in females than males. And that is exactly why I think this topic should be studied. There's this phenomena called telescoping, which we'll come to later, and this demonstrates that. In rodents, however, females drink more than males. Going to the next stage, which is the withdrawal stage, they do note that females more than males have a very negative emotional state or a dysphoric effect lasting for a longer amount of time during the withdrawal stage. But in rodents, it's the opposite, that withdrawal symptoms are more in males compared to females. And then we look at the preoccupation anticipation state, which is the craving phase. And they do say that stress-induced relapse is more in females, anxiety-induced relapse more in females, sporadic, they've not mentioned it here, but sporadic relapse or cue-induced relapse is also more in females, which perhaps brings us to the question that perhaps women are using alcohol for a different reason than men. Is it self-medication? We'd come to know in the next couple of slides. Okay. We've got these two studies, and they do say that females might be more motivated to drink alcohol for negative reinforcement than males. Please note, negative reinforcement is not punishment. It's the removal of an aversive stimuli, for example, having a dysphoric effect. So on the left-hand side, they state that the results from the largest drinking motive study conducted to date suggest that there should be gender-specific prevention, and that should take into account different motivational pathways. So these are the mechanistic sex differences that we were talking about previously. And they say that positive reinforcement, that is drinking to get a high, feeling good, seems to be more important for boys, and negative reinforcement seems to be the driving factor in girls. And on the right-hand side, they show the same results, albeit in a different paper. They say that sensation seeking motivates substance use during adolescence, but it's more so for males. Okay. Going on to this study, they say that if substance abuse is again the end manifestation of a cycle, for For men, it is through the pathway of prefrontal cortex striatum hyperactivity, causing impulsivity, sensation seeking, causing substance use. For women, which are these red hollow arrows, it's a interaction between stressful experiences, internalizing disorders, and amygdala activation, which leads to substance abuse. So this perpetuates the self-medication hypothesis, right? That depression and anxiety may be the key mediators of drinking in adolescent girls, and impulsivity and sensation seeking may be the key mediators for boys and for men. And this is an excellent study to kind of demonstrate that. So this is a study done in adult men and women. And what it basically says is that we should be aware that liking is mediated by our nucleus accumbens, and craving is mediated by dorsal striatum. So when we like something, our nucleus accumbens fires up. There's dopamine activation there. When it becomes more of a compulsive habitual use, the dorsal striatum takes over. So there's a shift from ventral to dorsal mode of drinking. And they saw that compared to men who drank alcohol, when women drank alcohol, there was less activation in nucleus accumbens and more activation in the dorsal striatum. What that means is that when women are drinking, they're perhaps not drinking because they're feeling more pleasurable or it's giving them a high, but more out of a compulsivity phenomena that's happening. So it progresses from a casual pleasure to avid and compulsive intake that's going on. Going on to hormones, gender, and alcohol. Just a brief kind of go through of 12th standard, first, second years of MBBS. We do know that acute and chronic alcohol administration, they do disrupt the functioning of the endocrine system. And we have two main axes of the endocrine system. We have the HPA axis, which mediates stress, and we have the HPG axis, which concerns itself with reproduction. And the HPA axis consists of the hypothalamus, which secretes the corticotrophin releasing factor, which acts on the pituitary, which I believe releases ACTH, which acts on the adrenal medulla and causes release of glucocorticoids. So that's the HPA axis. HPG axis is hypothalamus releases gonadotrophin releasing hormones, which then act on the pituitary, causes release of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone releases estradiol, and luteinizing hormone releases progesterone. I believe that's the basic flow and flow chart that is there, right? What we do know is these two axes kind of act on each other. The end products of the stress axis, the glucocorticoids, act on the gonadal axis. Testosterone, progesterone, and estrogen also act on the HPA axis. So there's a reciprocal interaction between them. And so all these four hormones are called steroid hormones. So they can be sex steroids or they can be stress steroids. So progestins have two receptor isoforms, A and B. Estrogens have two receptor isoforms, alpha and receptor beta. Androgens bind to androgen receptors, and glucocorticoids preferentially bind to mineralocorticoids. And second is glucocorticoid receptors. They are called neuroactive steroids and neurosteroids because they have rapid actions at the cell membrane. So progesterone derivatives and glucocorticoid derivatives are potent positive allosteric modulators of GABA-A. They can rapidly alter neuronal inhibition. How does that figure into alcohol use? Well, we have a number of clinical and preclinical studies. From the clinical aspect of it, two studies were done with small cohorts of male and female patients, and they had co-occurring AUD and cocaine use disorder. And they found that progesterone administration decreased cue-induced craving and cortisol responses. And both male and female subjects had a similar response. What they did notice was that progesterone was metabolized to allopregnanolone. I'm going to call it allo because the word is too big for me. So allo levels determined the magnitude of the response. Higher allo levels, higher the magnitude of response. So this was not sex specific. This was seen across the board for both of them. Again, in terms of species-specific responses, a significant reduction in alloprogesterone and estradiol levels were detected upon detoxification in women. And these levels recovered to baseline values after 4 months of abstinence. So there was a significant decrease in sex steroids during chronic alcohol administration and detoxification. And these were found to revert back to baseline after abstinence, but this was not replicated in rodents and primates. So there is a difference between clinical and preclinical studies. There is a difference between the menstrual cycle in humans and the estrous cycle in rodents. Secondly, we have models for PTSD, right? And one of the models was exposure to predator odor stress. And they noted that when you're exposed to predator odor stress, there was a significantly increased incidence of drinking and self-administration in rodents, more in females versus males. And their corticosterone levels were also increased more in females versus males. So perhaps trauma and PTSD has a greater impact and greater mediation in alcohol consumption in females more than males. And this again correlates with what we have been seeing in our clinical practice. Okay, this is an interesting frontier that we are discovering right now. We have neuropeptides and we have G protein coupled receptor systems. From that whole group, there are subsets which are called orphan neuropeptides and orphaned G protein coupled receptor systems. So the orphan neuropeptides, their receptors have not been discovered as yet, and the orphan G protein receptor systems, their ligands are not discovered as yet. And the GPCRs have five main categories, and most of the orphan GPCRs are found in class A, that is rhodopsin, and glutamate class C GPCRs, and almost 50% of them are expressed in the brain. How does that figure into alcohol consumption? Well, if we take just one neuropeptide called the cocaine and amphetamine regulated transcript, CART, and it's encoded by the CART-PT genes, and it exists in 2 forms. And it's been implicated in a variety of functions in the human body. So energy balance, depression, anxiety, reward behaviors, which includes alcohol use disorders, and also a number of factors that increase alcohol consumption. So stress, anxiety, taste, and social interactions. So I would emphasize taste because taste is an important and an often overlooked factor mediating our alcohol preference, and it's critical in driving our intake of alcohol. If we find beer bitter, the chances are I'm not going to take it again. So we've known that women do prefer wines more than beer, and taste is supposed to be one of the driving factors. And CART is also implicated in the perception of taste. What they did was they've taken a population of rodents and they've kind of cancelled out the CART gene. And they found out that these population of rodents and the women amongst them, they perceive bitter taste more strongly, and they therefore avoided alcohol consumption. But if you add sweetener, that was overturned. And this happened only with respect to binge drinking and not normal regular drinking patterns. So this is a very, very interesting study because we are looking at this being a possible potential treatment target in the future. As I just said, it was a sexually dimorphic effect, which means CART knockout in women, in female rodents had no effect, but CART knockout in male rodents, CART knockout in female rodents decreased their binge consumption, but in male rodents it had no effect. And the CEA is the central nucleus of the amygdala, and that is also part of the taste center. And they said that even if we kind of deactivate that center, that also increases the bitter taste sensitivity. So 2 ways by which we could approach this. Okay. Going on to genetics, gender, and alcohol. Okay, so we do know that alcohol use disorder strongly runs in families. We do know that twin and adoption studies have very strongly demonstrated a genetic contribution to AUDs. But till date, we have 3 questions that remain. So what's the quantity of what's the environmental influence, and how does it impact risk for AUDs, and what's the proportion of AUDs that's significantly impacted by the environment? Are the genetic effects stronger in males than in females? And are the risk factors same for males and females? I will take representative 3 studies which have tried to address this particular question. The first one is Cloninger studies, and we are aware of Cloninger, and we are aware of type 1, type 2, alcohol use disorders. But what he basically did was he wanted to investigate the contributions of genes versus environment in the development of alcohol use. And he looked at male Swedish adoptees. They were all sons who were born to single women in Stockholm, and they were adopted by non-relatives at a very early age. And he looked at the development of alcohol use disorders in them, right? And they've looked at whether their parents, their biological parents took alcohol or not. A sister study was also done, wherein the female adoptees were also taken in for consideration. So what were the results of these studies? So if both parents did not take alcohol, this was a particular risk that was noted. 14.7 to 2.8 was the proportion of sons and the proportion of daughters who did develop problems with alcohol. If it was just the father who was consuming alcohol, the risk was increased for both, sure, but the risk was more for the sons than the daughters. If it was only the mother who was consuming alcohol, the risk was more for sons, yes, but the jump was definitely greater for women. And if both of them were consuming alcohol, the risk jumped for both of them, but surprisingly less in daughters. So we are looking at the parental gender contributing to alcohol use disorders, and the gender of the children, and how that interacts with the parental gender. So very interesting study. And based on this, Cloninger came up with this typology, type 1 alcohol and type 2 alcoholism, wherein he said this was mediated by both genetic and environmental factors, and it affects both men and women equally. But within type 2 alcoholism, it affects men more often than women. The rest of the differences, I think we all know, so I'll not ponder too long on them. The second study in the genetic study of alcohol use disorders, this was in 2015, and they found that environment had a modest share to contribute in alcohol use disorders, only 10%. And they said that both males and females, there was no major difference in heritability, and there was no qualitative sex differences noted. So this kind of overturned the existing pattern of thought that heritability was more in males compared to females. But of course, this being science and this being psychiatry in general, we have another study published by Kendler, which overturned that belief. And they said that we've taken a lot of data from 3 registers, medical, crime, and pharmacy. And they noted that the genetic heritability of AUD was more in males compared to females, more than twice as high. And there was a substantially stronger familial environment which contribute to alcohol use disorders in female twin and sibling pairs, but there was no qualitative sex differences. Okay. Coming to the clinical course, telescoping is a word which will come up very often when we are talking of alcohol use disorders in women. And this was the paper that talked about it first. So in this particular paper with Nick J. Piazza, this was, I think, published in 1989. I'm not very sure about this. So he took a small subset of women, and he noted that they were consuming alcohol at a later age compared to men, correct? But there are certain landmarks in the consumption of alcohol. From the time you first start drinking, the time you get drunk or intoxicated, to the time you develop medical and legal problems, to the time you present to the OPD. So he noted that within a shorter span of time, women were passing through all these landmarks compared to males. So women were starting later, but were catching up faster. So in this study, it was around 11 to 12 years that a man would pass through all these stages. But in women, it was 8 to 9 years. So a difference of almost 4 to 5 years. And telescoping also indicates that at a smaller level of alcohol consumption and for a smaller duration of time, women will develop more medical and more psychiatric comorbidities compared to men. So women have a lot more to lose from developing this disorder than men do. So when a person walks in or a woman walks into the OPD, the average clinical presentation would be that they start drinking later and they consume less and not likely to binge drink. And they generally present with more severe clinical issues, and they present with more financial, family, social, and psychiatric problems. They are more likely to be seen by primary care services. And this is very, very important. They might not come to sole de-addiction services. They might come to general psychiatry. They might come to the primary care services first. And the ratio was pretty abysmal. I mean, there was the study done in NIMHANS previously. The ratio was 57:1. So for every 57 males, only one woman would present to the OPD. I think they followed up a decade later, and the ratio has significantly become better. So treatment seeking has increased in women as well. Let's not forget that it's not just about consumption. Women do experience a disproportionate secondhand harm from their spouses, significant others, and family members. And men, on the other hand, are likely to demonstrate extremely harmful, hazardous patterns of alcohol use, drink driving, aggressive, antisocial behavior. But women are also more likely than men to support alcohol control policies. What are the predictors of treatment? A good predictor is having a stable marriage. Note that I've underlined stable. Being employed, a higher education, and children who are supportive. Please note that pre-existing mood and anxiety disorder is a good prognostic indicator for women rather than men. In terms of marriage, marriage is actually a risk factor, or cohabitation is actually a risk factor for women, and it's supposed to be protective for men. In terms of the components of the service, what would benefit more? Would you offer the same range of services to a woman who presents to you for treatment versus a man? The answer is no. You would have to tinker about and give something very, very specific. Women in general have more barriers in seeking treatment. There is external stigma, there is internal stigma, there's lack of childcare, there's a lot of stigma, systemic barriers. And they also have a greater belief that their alcohol issues will resolve on their own. So these are the significant barriers that we have to overcome while providing treatment to our women patients. The program components that do help, though, are women's only groups, childcare services, individual counseling, having special services for women who are pregnant, trauma affected, or have other significant psychiatric comorbidities. It's also called dual diagnosis. They do better in women only residential and OPD settings. They do better with training programs like childcare, parenting training, assertiveness training, family planning, and they do average more days in care, but that is associated with a better outcome. They are more than twice as likely to complete treatment, more than 2 times less likely to report substance abuse at follow-up, compared with women in mixed gender treatment. The improvement is also, we should not just keep alcohol use disorder as the only indicator of improvement. Overall psychological well-being, HIV risk reduction, pregnancy outcomes, all of these other parameters did respond as well. How are the outcomes? Short term, they have longer inpatient stays, and it's associated with a sustained abstinence. Longer term, there have been mixed results. Some have said worse outcomes, some have said equivalent outcome. But we do know that during the first 5 years of recovery, women do report a lower quality of life and self-esteem. And if you correlate that to the first couple of sites wherein withdrawal was associated with a greater dysphoric effect compared to men and for a longer duration of time, this would make sense. In alcohol use, we have some major studies being done, which were Match, Combine, and UK-ATT, and they said that at follow-up, women were more likely to be in the abstinent or asymptomatic low-risk drinking category. So we have some very positive news in that regard. In terms of the specific medical complications, women develop more liver damage, more likely than men to develop alcoholic hepatitis, to die of cirrhosis. And these changes are more likely to persist even after you abstain from alcohol, which is very worrying. In terms of cardiac illnesses, women are more sensitive to cardiac contractile differentials, more prone to cardiomyopathy, and the level at which we see the harm is significantly at a lesser level of drinking compared to men. In breast cancer, there is a definite dose-response relationship between alcohol and risk of breast cancer. In one study, there was a huge jump, 12% increase in the risk for one drink per day for the average alcohol consumption. And this is supposed to be because alcohol produces estrogen receptor changes and sensitivity. In terms of the brain CNS, the same story. More brain damage, atrophy occurs faster, higher risk of subarachnoid hemorrhage. Fetal alcohol spectrum is a huge topic. So it's not just the classical triad of growth retardation and minor facial anomalies. It's a spectrum ranging from just cognitive deficits or behavioral problems like ADHD to the full-blown spectrum disorder. This is not dose related, may occur even at low levels, and especially if ingested in early pregnancy. Please note, binge drinking is associated with more of problems than regular low volume drinking. Comorbidities, I think we've seen this. Major depressive disorder, specific phobia, secondary depression, more common. PTSD is also more common. And something that we need to keep in mind, eating disorders is also more common in women compared to men. In terms of treatment, I'm just going to look at the policy level interventions and then at specific pharmacotherapeutic agents. And in the policy level interventions, we see a gender blindness. Most of these policies are designed to keeping in mind what has worked for men, but what has worked for women is something that we need to keep on discovering. So we do know that the determinants that increase the consumption of alcohol is increased acceptability, increased availability, and increased affordability. So you combat that by raising awareness and restricting their marketing, advertising. With availability, you regulate licensing of shops, you regulate online sales. In terms of affordability, increasing the prices, increasing the excise taxes, marketing, all of that are measures which the government can take to decrease alcohol consumption, but this is what has worked for men. In terms of women, the acceptability, we do know that alcohol labeling can be used to enable informed decisions about the products. And this is especially helpful in prompting conversation about risks of alcohol consumption in women of childbearing age and in women who are pregnant. So in that particular population, it may be effective. And earlier bar closing times in Brazil was associated with a reduction in homicides and assaults against women. Affordability, women drinkers may be slightly more likely than men to respond to changes in the price of alcohol. And a 1% increase in the price of alcohol was associated with around a 3 to 3.5% report, a reduction of 3.1 to 3.5% in wife abuse. So there's still a lot of scope for us to have more data. There are some social initiatives which have worked. So where women brew alcohol, we have to provide them alternate means of income, as happened in Tanzania. We have some institutions in Pakistan, like the Peace Inn, which works specifically with women-centric approach, and that has worked. And in New Zealand, we have Maori wardens, and they take a very strong role in regulating alcohol consumption. So perhaps we can take some inspiration from them. On the other hand, look how far the alcohol industry has come in utilizing our knowledge of what works for women. So they've developed something called the pinking of drinks. And that's developing drinks that are colorful, stylized, pretty, appealing to look at, flavored. You can talk about wine, you can talk about alcopops. We have surrogate marketing, wherein alcohol companies are packaging juices and drinks, all of that. It also draws a notion of femininity. So how many alcohol brands say, come enjoy Women's Day with, champagne toast with your mom, or Mother's Day. This is the time for you to gain independence, celebrate with your girlfriends. So it draws on these third wave feministic issues. celebrity endorsements, of course, and even sponsorships, including gender-based violence. So this happened in Sri Lanka, where a beer company, I believe, wanted to sponsor a campaign on stop domestic violence, and it was kind of rooted out by the women in the community there. So this was happening. In terms of the individual molecules at play, so with respect to acamprosate, the effect size is reported to be comparable. And it helps in their sleep, is what they say, more in women compared to men, but they're also more likely to have side effects. And though women come with a significantly greater history of anxiety, depression, suicide attempts, and interpersonal loss, they do comparably well with acamprosate. With respect to naltrexone, I think in the combined study, they said that women and men had similar outcomes, but there are two other studies which kind of refuted the claim. So injectable naltrexone, they said in women, it's as good as placebo, and nausea was a significant side effect, which was very distressing for the women. And in another study, they said that only men showed a greater reduction in drinks following daily oral naltrexone. We need more data on this. Disulfiram, abysmal data, less than 1% of women, if you take all their study population in account, we really can't draw any inferences, but in cocaine use disorder, it has worsened outcome. In baclofen, we do note that in the studies, they gave lower doses of baclofen, but they do not address it. In one study, there was no significant differences, but in another study, they said 11 times more likely that women would achieve abstinence compared to men. So ondansetron is something we don't regularly use as an augmenting agent. It's disputed efficacy is there, but they say that a subset of women with some polymorphism in the D4 gene, they were perhaps more likely to benefit from ondansetron than the rest of the population. So again, food for thought. And with this, I conclude the complete seminar. And I would like to end with not just a summing up of the clinical points, but with a take-home message to whoever has attended this. The idea that one drink doesn't hurt. The idea of us doctors practicing what we preach. The idea of us being aware of marketing when we look at movies and we see alcohol being consumed by the women there. Is it going to stay, or are we going to push it aside and say we are overthinking a lot? Is something that the future will tell us. On the left is a famous singer who said that, dry addictions are far more harmful than wet addictions. And so alcohol is nothing, it's not even an addiction. On the other end of the spectrum, we have Betty Ford, who set up a number of rehabilitation centers in alcohol in the US, and she herself has been a survivor of the same. And she says that I know I was an alcoholic because I was so preoccupied whether alcohol was going to be served or not. So rather than romanticizing alcohol, we do acknowledge that it can cause a lot of issues in a lot of people, and it's not so pretty to look at when we see them face to face. So do doctors practice what they preach? I think that will be the real test for us. With that, I end my presentation, and I think we open it up for discussion.
Thank you for such a wonderful lecture. I think it was a learning experience for me as well. There were so many take-home messages from your presentation. It was absolutely concise, apt, and to the point, and there were a lot of new things to learn from them. I now open the forum to the audience. If any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask, or you can put it in the chat box.
Okay.
Anyone from the audience has any questions?
Either they were all outstanding, or I had a fantastic lecture. One of the two.
Right.
Yeah.
well. So either you were very lucid or you were very lucid.
That's true.
Nonetheless, it was fantastic, and it's interesting that there are so many gender-specific domains about substance abuse, alcohol in particular, and it's interesting that you brought it all out so lucidly and so elaborately, and really, really well put together. So, thank you very much. And Swaroop, you have any questions for her?
No, no, I don't have any questions. I think whatever she presented, I think it was definitely out of the box. I really loved your presentation, and there were a lot of good points. Even I was not aware of so many gender differences, on the biological and molecular level that you had compiled all the data together. I think that was a fantastic lecture.
Thank you.
Uh, Definitely, yes. So that is my feedback on that. I don't have any questions per se. I think you have already given us all the data that was required, and it was very quite apt to the topic that was given to you.
Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Abhijna. Thank you so much, Swaroop. And thank you all for being with us this evening for this very, very exciting discussion on gender and alcohol. We are not being sexist, we are being biological, right? So that's the take home for all of us. And we continue to endeavor to bring you these kind of interesting talks all the time on this platform. And we have younger and younger psychiatrists who are now teachers, who are now active participants in training of postgraduate students, but they also train old fogies like me. So it's a continuous learning process, and that's endorsed by the fact that we have as many consultants as we have postgraduate students on our lecture series in the audience. And these are available for perpetuity on the website. So these lectures are uploaded to the website, and even today's talk will be uploaded by the end of today or maybe tomorrow sometime in the afternoon. And you will be able to access this any number of times for you to be able to revisit some of the excellent points that Abhijna has made. And we thank you all for continuing to be a part of this. And we thank Sun Pharma for providing unflinching, continued support. So thank you once again, Abhijna. Thank you once again, Swaroop, for making the time for this talk today. And I hope to see you all again next month with another interesting chapter in the postgraduate teaching series.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Have a great evening ahead.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Good night.
bye.
Bye.
Bye.